Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel McClellan. Welcome to History Valley, Dan.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. Daniel received his bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, where he focused on Biblical Hebrew and minored in Classical Greek. He completed a Master's of Studies in Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford in July of 2010, and a Master of Arts in Biblical Studies in 2013 at Trinity Western University, just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia. In early 2020, he defended his doctoral dissertation written for the University of Exeter on the cognitive science of religion and the conceptualization of deity and divine agency in the Hebrew Bible. In 2018, he was the Democratic candidate for the Utah State House of Representatives in House District 52. He also was once a Democratic candidate for the Utah State Senate in Senate District 10 for the 2020 election. He currently works as a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, and he adjunct teaches in the Ancient Scripture Department at Brigham Young University. And today we're going to be talking about one of the many articles he has written. It's called "What is Deity?" in the LXX Deuteronomy. So my first question for you today, Dan, is how is God portrayed in the book of Deuteronomy?
Well, the book of Deuteronomy, as near as we can tell from the data, is something that was likely initially composed or started to be put together in the 7th century BCE, probably late 7th century BCE. And as near as we can tell, one of the rhetorical goals of the composition of this book was to institutionalize, authorize some cultic reforms that were underway as a result of King Josiah's attempts to basically make permanent a cultic centralization in Jerusalem. So under King Hezekiah, the Assyrian king Sennacherib came through and devastated Israel and Judah, destroyed a number of cult sites, which basically forced everyone to Jerusalem for their worship. And so that resulted in this de facto cult centralization. And the later kings likely tried to restore some of that earlier worship that likely involved Ashura, perhaps other deities that involved other cult sites. And from what we can tell, it seems Josiah liked having everyone come to Jerusalem, liked having the priesthood that he controlled being the one main priesthood. And so if we talk about the rhetorical goal of Deuteronomy, it seems to be to say, here's the law again, but all this stuff that has changed is now going to be permanent. Only it's framed as a retelling of the law put into the mouth of Moses. And so the deity of the book of Deuteronomy is one that is concerned for a single cult site, a single priesthood. It's also a deity that they do want to kind of distance a little bit from humanity, particularly the portions of Deuteronomy that were written into the exile and the post-exilic period, where when the temple was destroyed, that basically you had to rationalize it in one of two ways. You could say either the other nation's deity defeated our deity, or our deity is upset with us and has abandoned their cult site, allowing it to be destroyed. And so one of the rhetorical maneuvers to try to preserve the sovereignty of the God of Israel over Israel was to say the deity was not in the temple. The deity is located in the heavens. And so we have the story in Deuteronomy 4 where there's the pillar of fire and the deity says, you heard my voice, but you did not see any form. I was not in the fire. The deity is located in the heavens. And this is an attempt to distance the deity's self from the temple, which is now a place where the deity's name dwells, and it's kind of manifests the deity's presence, but is not the deity themselves. And so Deuteronomy, in that sense, is a much different deity from what we see in some of the earlier texts in Genesis, in Exodus. Now, Leviticus, portions of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and some of the later historical books were written in the exilic and post-exilic periods as well. And so they reflect that different conceptualization of deity as well. But they were written by other authors, and so there are some differences from Deuteronomy as well. And so you're looking at kind of a transition period between a deity that is immanent, that is present, that inhabits their temple, and a deity that inhabits the heavens is being universalized to
Mm,
where the heavens are the deity's throne and the earth is their footstool, rather than the deity lives in the temple all the time. And I think those are probably the main things that stick out about the conceptualization of deity in Deuteronomy.
mm. Does the LXX Deuteronomy remind you of the Dead Sea Scrolls version of the Book of Deuteronomy, which says something very similar, that Yahweh or the Lord inherited Israel, and each nation was given their own God. And in the
Mm-hmm.
Septuagint LXX Deuteronomy, it's instead angels of God.
Right. And so we've had the Septuagint translation of Deuteronomy longer than we've had the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mm,
And so a lot of scholars looked at this passage, and it says angeloi theou, angels of God, and they realized, the Septuagint translators like to take the phrase B'nai Elohim, children of God, and
mm,
translate that as angels of God. In Job 1:6 and 2:1 are just a couple of examples. And so some scholars had hypothesized maybe that's what's going on in Deuteronomy 32:8, is that originally this was a reference to the B'nai Elohim. And then with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly 4Q Deuteronomy J, we had a confirmation of that. The reading B'nai Elohim is in that fragment.
mm,
And so, in that sense, the Septuagint reflects a source text much more in line with what we find preserved at Qumran. Now,
mm,
there's another significant passage in Deuteronomy 32, verse 43, that is also altered in the Masoretic text, where you have a reference to it's a quote that is found in Psalm 97:7. Bow down to him, all gods.
mm,
And in the Masoretic version of Deuteronomy 32:43, this is absent. But we find in the Septuagint, we find something closer to the change in the Masoretic text. But then we also find something that reflects that source text underlying the Greek translation. And so it seems that the Septuagint translator had either multiple source texts and combined them to create kind of a conflated passage, or their own source text had conflated these two different versions, one of which ends up in the fragment from Qumran that we have, and the other of which ends up in the Masoretic text. So it's pretty complex, the heritage of these passages as we find them at Qumran and the Septuagint. There's very clearly overlap, but there's
mm.
also very clearly some distinction, separate streams of tradition.
Would you say that the Book of Deuteronomy portrays El and Yahweh as two separate deities?
I think that there are portions of Deuteronomy, and the main one is Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9,
Mm,
that most likely in their original setting distinguished Elyon from Adonai. I think when it was placed in the position it currently occupies within the Song of Moses, within Deuteronomy 32, I think whoever put it there probably didn't read it that way. And certainly not in the final form of the full book of Deuteronomy, because we have in Deuteronomy 4:19, we have a much later reflection of what is in Deuteronomy 32:8. So this is like a later editor knows what's in Deuteronomy 32:8. They're kind of referring to it, alluding to it, but they alter it a little bit. So Deuteronomy 32:8 says that Elyon distributed the nations according to the number of the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, and Adonai's portion was Israel. Deuteronomy 4:19 says, when you look up at the stars, the moon, the sun, make sure you don't worship them like the nations did. And then it says that
Mm.
Adonai distributed the gods to the nations. So rather than the nations to the gods, we now have the gods to the nations. And rather than Elyon doing the distribution, now we have Adonai doing the distributing. So I would suggest this reflects, and Deuteronomy 4 is probably one of the later literary layers within Deuteronomy. This probably reflects that editor's take. They're trying to reframe what's going on in Deuteronomy 32. And so certainly by the time of the final form of Deuteronomy, Elyon and Adonai had already long been conflated.
Mm. In the Masoretic text, it seems to be modifying what the earlier copies of Deuteronomy say, and they rephrase Deuteronomy 32:8-9. So instead of sons of God, it's children of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So does it look in context of that, in tandem with that? This is what I ask about that. Was the author of Deuteronomy, the original version of Deuteronomy, a henotheist or possibly a polytheist?
That's an interesting question. I think there were probably a good mix of both. I think there were most likely folks in this period who worshipped El to the exclusion of others. There were probably some who worshipped Adonai to the exclusion of others. There were probably some that worshipped both of them. There were probably some that also worshipped Ashura in the periods leading up to the 7th century BCE, when her worship became more problematized. And so those categories, I think, are not perfect. They have some issues as well, and I think they kind of overlap and bleed into each other to some degree. So I think that most of these folks acknowledge the existence of other deities. In fact, I think throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, there is an acknowledgement of the existence of other deities. And I imagine that in the earliest layers of Deuteronomy, which may go back to the 11th or 10th century BCE, they most likely worshipped other deities. Whether it was Elyon or El and Adonai and Ashura, or if there were others included as well. This is a pretty big question for scholars right now, but I don't think we have enough data to know for sure.
Do you think that the distinction between El and Yahweh could also be found in the two creation accounts in the book of Genesis, when El goes to sleep and then Yahweh appears in the garden and creates Adam and Eve after the 6-day creation story ends with the 7th day, the Sabbath?
I think there's definitely something going on with these two different creation accounts. I don't know that I would tie them together by saying one deity goes to sleep and another shows up to continue the creation. There are folks who have talked about Adam as a deity in some aspect. In my opinion, the second creation account, what we have in Genesis 2 and 3, is probably the earlier account. And an interesting aspect of that account is we have the introduction of the Tetragrammaton, the divine name Adonai. However, that name is never used in any of the dialogue. You have the serpent, Adam, and Eve all referring to Elohim exclusively. None of them ever refer to Adonai. And so the name is exclusive to the narrative framework. It's not until Genesis 4:1 where Eve says, I have begotten a man with Adonai, that one of them actually uses the name Adonai. And so, in my opinion, that probably was not Adonai in Genesis 2. Now, Genesis 1 is probably exilic or post-exilic in origin. And so that by that time, the deities are already conflated. However, the author found some kind of rhetorical value in only referring to Elohim. And some scholars have speculated that this is an attempt to universalize the deity. So this is not the God of Israel's name. This is the God's name. So it's a way to genericize the deity and say this works for any nation, because God is now God of all the universe rather than just the God located within Israel. And so I imagine that's why the divine name is omitted from Genesis 1. but I think it's probably not Adonai in Genesis 2 and 3 that's being described, but some later editors are adding that. And another hint in this direction is
Hmm.
this combined name, Adonai Elohim, which we don't find anywhere else in Genesis. I've got to remember, I don't think we find that combined form of Adonai Elohim anywhere else in Genesis apart from Genesis 2 and 3. And
Hmm.
I think it is not unlikely that it initially just referred to Elohim, and the scribe came in and wrote in Adonai right before it. Because we do see in some other literature outside the Bible these combined deities. For instance, at Elephantine, we have Anat Yahu, which
Hmm.
is the combination of Anat and Adonai. And so I think it's likely that these editors came in when the narrative framework was being added and said we're gonna write in Adonai before Elohim, and that created this combined name, which in most English translations is traditionally rendered as the Lord God. Which probably wouldn't have made any sense to anyone until that tradition had become well established within Israel and Judah.
Hmm. In Psalms, when it talks about the Lord appearing before the council,
Mm-hmm.
and some say, well, that's evidence right there that God was originally, well, Adonai wasn't originally God necessarily, but he was appearing as a council member to a much larger pantheon.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that's evidence that the original version of not just Deuteronomy, but the original Old Testament as a whole, originally distinguished Adonai from El? And later, as the Old Testament was constantly revised and modified, they were cleaning it up of anything that made it look like polytheistic until we get to the Masoretic text.
I think that there was definitely a distinction in the earliest periods, and some of those are preserved in some of our earliest texts. But I think the texts that go back to that period are very, very few and far between. They're just some
Mm,
largely poetic fragments. There's an argument that has been made by a handful of scholars, Daniel Pioski, Seth Sanders, a number of others, that we don't find historical prose in
mm,
Northwest Semitic languages written down until the middle of the 9th century. And so any of the historical narratives that we have in the Bible would not have been committed to text until the tradition of historical prose developed. So that would mean that none of the narratives, the historical narratives, could predate about 850 BCE. And I'm of the opinion that the conflation of Adonai and El probably took place in the 10th century, a narrative from the northern kingdom that was appropriated by the southern kingdom following the fall of the northern
mm,
kingdom in 722 BCE. A lot of that narrative has been altered in order to scrub it clean of uh, other deities, at least favorable references to other deities. And also, they added layers, literary layers, to vilify the kings of the northern kingdom who probably were recognizing these deities that were being worshipped without anybody giving them a hard time until the later Judahites who took over this literature were basically renegotiating their own history. And this would have been the same kind of thing that was going on with Josiah and Deuteronomy. And so I think there's a degree to which some of it has been edited, but the majority of the Hebrew Bible was composed in later periods, I think, after the conflation of the two deities.
Was Hilkiah who is said to have found the law in Second
Mm-hmm.
Kings? And many scholars say that was just specifically referring to Deuteronomy. Do you think he believed in more than one deity? Do you think he personally believed that Yahweh was El's son? Uh, and the same question goes for Josiah, King Josiah.
Mm-hmm. I I don't know. We don't really have much historical evidence for Hilkiah, but by that time period, by the 7th century, If there was a historical Hilkiah, I think they probably recognized that other deities were thought to exist, that they
Mm.
probably recognized there was a time during which Elyon and Adonai were separate. They most likely accepted their combination. And I think Josiah probably, if the theory is correct, that Deuteronomy was written in an effort to authorize and make permanent these reforms, then Josiah most likely was aware of that as well, and was engaging in this literary creation in order to make popular what he wanted the normative beliefs, behaviors to be. And so I imagine that they were most likely aware of what was going on earlier. And most of the literature that would have been handed down, they would have had revised copies of it. And so they would have had a lot more information than we do now regarding the nature of the earliest relationship between Adonai and Elyon. So I think it's likely they were aware of it if they didn't accept it.
Hmm. Do you think that ultimately, not just Deuteronomy, but the rest of the Torah, of all the little insinuations of El and Yahweh being father and son, do you think ultimately that it's possible that even certain things that Adonai had done is could have been him taking over the role of other gods? Not just that, but in tandem with I think this is in Kings, yeah, when it talks about uh, the fighting between Israel and Moab in the early first
Mm-hmm.
millennium BCE. They have this stone, the Meshastila, and in it looks like it's suggesting that another god had defeated Adonai and the Jews
Mm-hmm.
in combat. What do you think of all that?
I think it is likely that
Hmm.
as uh, came into contact with other conceptualizations of deity, there were two routes that could be taken.
Hmm.
They could defeat them, or they could absorb them. And I think probably the clearest example of absorption is Adonai's absorption of the sovereignty, the powers associated with their consort, with Ashura. So
Hmm.
relationships to fertility, for child rearing, for conception, for lactation, these kinds of things were likely things that Adonai began to have sovereignty over. And there are a number of scholars who believe that a lot of the references to the Asherim in the Hebrew Bible, so the cultic stand that would have represented Asherah in the earliest periods, that in the later periods, particularly leading up to Josiah, that stand would have been appropriated by Adonai and would have become a Yahwistic cult object. So I think that's probably where we have the most data that could be interpreted to indicate this absorption of their power. And a lot of scholars also think that the representation of Adonai in some of the early literature as a storm deity was not their original divine profile, but was a divine profile that they took up when they arrived in the northern hill country. Now, there's the other deity there that is the northwest Semitic storm deity, and that's Baal or Baal Hadad or Balu. And rather than be absorbed with this deity, as we see most likely between Elyon and Adonai, there is combat, there is friction, there is fighting, because they're both trying to fill the same role. And so this is the combat of the priests of Adonai or Elijah versus the priests of Baal. And this is a way to defeat the other deity that already does the same thing Adonai does. And the Mesha Stele, I think that I don't know that it refers to the events that are narrated in 2 Kings chapter 3,
Hmm.
but it is likely that 2 Kings chapter 3 preserves an early historical memory of Moab having thrown off their vassalage, and this coalition, the Edomite, Judahite, Israelite coalition, going into Moab to try to punish them for throwing off that vassalage. And yeah, it does seem to show in verse 27, you have the king who's cornered in his city, and the battle is not going his way, and in a moment of
Mm,
desperation offers his firstborn son, the heir to the throne, on the city wall as a burnt offering. And then it immediately says there was great fury against Israel, and they packed up and left. And this phrase "great fury," the Hebrew there is ketzef gadol, and ketzef occurs almost exclusively in reference to divine fury. Now, overwhelmingly Adonai's divine fury, but to divine fury. The only times it is not used in reference to divine fury are a couple of Persian period prose couplets where it is being used in a list of different synonyms for anger. And so here it seems to be referring to divine fury. And the only really reasonable way to interpret this is as a reference to some deity other than Adonai driving the Israelites off. Because some folks will say, well, no, they left voluntarily because they had done what they came to do, but they didn't come there. They didn't do what they came to do. And the verbs that are used to refer to their retreat are the same verbs that are used to refer to Sennacherib's retreat from Jerusalem several chapters later in Second Kings, after the angel of the Lord has killed 180,000 of his soldiers. The next
mm,
day they wake up. What happens when a an army with their patron deity leaves the purview of that deity? So Adonai's purview is the land of Israel. They're no longer in the land of Israel. They are in a land where another deity is sovereign. That would be Chemosh, the deity of the Moabites. And so Adonai is out of pocket, is not on their own territory, and they get defeated. And this coalition has to retreat back to Israel, and Moab remains free from vassalage. So I don't know if that is referencing the same events that are being referenced in the Moabite stele, but I do think that that is likely the preservation of a historical memory that the author was probably embarrassed enough about to kind of leave between the lines,
hmm
but also something prominent enough and well known enough that they did need to leave it in there. They probably did not have the freedom to alter it too much. And so the idea was the only reason we lost was because we were outside of our deity's territory, more or less.
mm.
That's how I look at it, but there are other takes on that.
We have a question from Christopher Malloy. Thank you for the $2 super
Yes,
chat. Did Zoroastrianism affect the Jewish deity?
that's a pretty common speculation uh,
Mm,
based on a few different things. Zoroastrianism is believed to have maintained a pretty dualistic notion where you have Angra Mainyu and Ahura Mazda, one evil, one good. And so some people think the concept of an evil divine being standing opposed to Adonai, so Satan, the devil, may have arisen from the interactions of early Judaism with Zoroastrianism in Babylon. That certainly seems plausible. I tend to think there's definitely some kind of influence rubbing off on Judaism while it's there, but we don't
mm,
have enough data to know for sure. And this is a lamentable state of affairs. We don't have enough scholars who are conversant in Hebrew and Greek and all the early Jewish scholarship, and also in Old Persian and a lot of the scholarship of Persia and Zoroastrianism. And so the few scholars that are able to do that uh, don't see enough data to really know for sure. But I would say, in my opinion, probably.
mm. Going back to what you were saying, that the author in Second Kings might have been thinking that, okay, our we lost because we went outside of our deity's territory. Would you
Mm-hmm.
connect that to God being, Adonai being given Israel specifically, and other gods are being given other nations in the original Deuteronomy 32?
I would, because one of the things that it states in verse 9, Deuteronomy 32:9,
hmm
is that Adonai's portion was Jacob. Israel and the text says his portion of the inheritance. And so we see Israel referred to as the inheritance of Adonai in a number of places in the Hebrew Bible. And this idea of inheritance only makes sense within the context of this notion that all the deities have their own inheritance. And so we see a couple different ways this is reflected in when Saul is pursuing David, for instance. There's a part where he's in the wilderness of Zin, and Saul is camped out in a cave on a mountain, and David is on the other side of the valley on another mountain, and he's shouting at Saul in the middle of the night. And he says that you're pushing me outside of the boundaries of Israel. You're pushing me outside of Adonai's inheritance, forcing me to worship other gods, reflecting this idea that Israel is Adonai's inheritance. And if you're outside Israel, you're in another deity's jurisdiction, and you owe that deity worship rather than Adonai. And it's reflected as well in the story of Naaman, the Syrian general who comes down and is healed by Elisha. And he says, I know that there is no deity in all the earth but in Israel. And this has been interpreted as Israel's deity is the only deity in all the earth, which is not quite accurate. What it's saying is no other territory has a deity in it. The only territory with a deity is Israel. And so he wants to worship Adonai back when he is in Syria, when he is in the temple of his master. And so how does he facilitate the worship of Adonai? He takes 2 cartloads of Israelite soil with him, basically saying, when I'm outside of Israel, I'm going to bring a chunk of Israel with me so that I can worship the God that only exists inside Israel. And I think this reflects that idea as well. And this is one of the main problems with the exile. How are we going to worship our deity when we're all in Babylon and the deity is back inside Israel? And another way, now this gets kind of massaged in later centuries as the other gods of the divine council are kind of shoved down and demoted to an angelic status. The idea that they still have sovereignty over the different nations of the world is still there. And we see this in the book of Daniel, which was probably written in the mid-2nd century BCE, with the references to the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, and Michael as the head prince. And so where it used to be every nation had a patron deity, those deities all became angels. And so now every nation has a guardian angel. And Persia has a guardian angel, Greece has a guardian angel, and then Israel's guardian angel is Michael, the archangel, the ruler of the angels. And so that idea, that framework, that organization is still there, but it's just been renegotiated.
Dustin Ellerby, thank you for the $3 super chat. Any connections between Persian Farsi and Pharisee?
Of etymologies that have been proposed. In fact, do I have? It's on my shelf, but there was a new book that came out last year called The Pharisees. In fact, hang on just a second. So, edited by Joseph Sievers and Amy Jill Levine, The Pharisees. It's a wonderful discussion of the Pharisees, but one of the, I think the initial chapter, the first chapter, interpreting the name Pharisee, is a discussion of the history of scholarship on the etymology of the word Pharisee. And it most likely comes from a root, parash, but we can't know for sure. And there's no indication it has anything to do with, as far as I'm aware, with the name of the language, the Persian language, Farsi.
So do you think there is a connection, or are you skeptical on that?
I'm a bit skeptical on that. I don't think there's a connection, but it's possible. If there's been any scholarship published on that, I'm not aware of it. Which is not to say there can't be.
Do you think Ashura, the wife of El, the queen of the Canaanite deities, do you think she was originally the mother of Adonai, as she was originally understood as the mother of the 70? deities?
So I think that Adonai probably was not brought into the pantheon of
Hmm.
Israelite deities until, like I said, probably the 11th, 10th century. And the idea of Ashura as the mother of the 70 sons of El, or children of El, which we find in the Ugaritic literature, that's from a few centuries earlier. And so I imagine that there were folks who, when this deity named Adonai appeared on the scene, they did try to situate that deity into their framework of their pantheon. And so probably treated Adonai as one of the B'nai Elohim, which would have meant prior to the conflation of El and Adonai, that Adonai would have been also one of the offspring of Ashura. But upon conflation with El, they then take over that El's consort as well. And we have something similar with there are in some of the Ugaritic literature, Dagon is a deity that does not seem to have, is not native to the pantheon and the region. And so you have similar attempts to try to fit Dagon in. And some folks seem to treat the deity as a foreigner to the pantheon, does not belong in the pantheon, whereas others try to fit the deity in. And so they had a complex kinship network, and it always had to be renegotiated and reconstituted when new deities showed up or when the deities changed their allegiances or their authority or things like that.
In Judges 119, when it talks about the Lord was with Judah and they were going, they were trying to get past, I think it was a mountain or something like that, and they got defeated by chariots fitted with iron. Is the author there trying to suggest that Adonai could be defeated by weapons of foreign nations? So he's kind of like at this point, he's not clearly not portrayed as an omnipotent deity.
Right. Yeah. Clearly not omnipotent. I would suggest that the idea there is more because Adonai is a mountain deity, they don't have experience with the chariots, and therefore Adonai is, manipulating the battle on their behalf.
Hmm.
And then suddenly this weapon with which they are not incredibly familiar shows up on the scene. And so Adonai gets caught behind the learning curve and doesn't know how to overcome the enemy's weaponry that is more native to the attempt to suggest that the deity is not, one, certainly not omnipotent, but two,
Hmm.
when faced with new challenges, has a bit of a learning curve that they have to get over. And I don't think that they actively conceptualize the deity as learning new things. But when it came to coming up with an excuse for being defeated, that did not include saying, oh, yeah, our deity got their butt kicked. They just said, our deity's learning still, is trying to figure this out. That was something they're not used to. We'll do better next time. So it's an excuse that I think I think it's peculiar that it was preserved in the text. I'm sure there were folks who were like, I don't think that belongs there. That's a little embarrassing.
Hmm. Do you think in the post composition of the Old Testament, with texts of Old Testament apocrypha, like take 3rd Enoch for example, when it says that Enoch, who became Metatron after his ascension into heaven, as he was taken into heaven by God, he became the lesser Yahweh. Is that evidence that some Israelites held on to the belief of more than one power?
I think likely. I
Hmm.
think there is. You see a few different ways that the Greco-Roman period Jewish literature into late antique Jewish literature is meditating on this concept of some kind of intermediary,
Hmm.
and is wondering about the intersection of deity and humanity and what kinds of entities occupy that intersection and what kind of entities may be able to travel back and forth across it. This is the Son of Man in earlier periods. Melchizedek even seems to be thought of in similar ways. And you have Metatron, you have Yahweh, you have a handful of other entities that seem to approach or seem to occupy that middle ground between deity and humanity. And in the book I
Hmm.
have coming out at the end of this year, the beginning of next year, I talk a little bit about the concept of divine agency as something that was communicable. And so the deity did not
Hmm.
have to be present for their agency, their presence, their power to inhabit an object or a person or something like that. And in that way, exercise their agency somewhere else. And I think some of these figures who become prominent in the Greco-Roman period and later are ways that folks are trying to figure out how precisely this agency could be utilized. And the messenger of Adonai, the angel of the Lord, I think is the first example of this, because you have that angel described as an angel. For instance, in Exodus 3:2 says the messenger of Adonai appeared to Moses in a flame of fire in the bush.
Hmm.
The entire rest of the chapter, it describes that entity as God themselves, going so far as having the entity say, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And so we already have in the Hebrew Bible this entity that is not God in a bunch of places, but is also God right next to those places. And I think that's probably the cue. That's probably the initial foundation on which folks are building. Well, what does this mean about these other entities, the Son of Man, Melchizedek, Metatron, all these? And so I think it's probably something they were just deliberating. And you had authors exploring that space. And so I think that's why you have some of these things like the Adonai Katon, the lesser Adonai, is an example, is a manifestation of the exploration of what's going on at the intersection of divine agency and humanity.
Hmm. Would you also take Judges 119 as another example of what happened in Second Kings at uh well, actually I think it was somewhere else. You can't really they're having a hard time winning when they go outside the bounds of Adonai's territory.
Yeah,
It just doesn't
yeah,
work out.
yeah. I think it's a way to make an excuse for a military loss by
Hmm.
appealing to these kind of widespread understandings that everybody's patron deity is sovereign over the territory that they possess. And you also see this elsewhere in Judges. I think Judges 11, where you have Jephthah, who
Hmm.
is a messenger to the Ammonites. I think, yeah, it's the Ammonites, and he accidentally identified, or for some reason they identify the deity of the Ammonites as Chemosh, but he
Hmm.
says, "You all keep the territory that Chemosh, your deity, has conquered for you, and we will keep the territory that Adonai, our deity, has conquered for us." And so this was a shared conceptualization, and I think some of those excuses for military defeats are deployments of that kind of shared framework of divine sovereignty as a way to say, our God is still our God. We just messed up this time.
Hmm. Do Mormons, well, when they look at Deuteronomy 42 and they see the Lord inheriting Israel from a greater God, because I know that in the Mormon point of view, Jesus is Yahweh incarnate. Is that so? Do they look at it as God giving His Son the people of Israel in that sense, and in context of Jesus calling Israel His people several
Mhm.
times in the New
Yeah.
Testament?
It's not all Latter-day Saints who think that, but those who are familiar with the biblical scholarship,
Hmm.
absolutely, that is quite common to read this as a distinction of Elohim and Adonai, which
Hmm.
is the same distinction that Latter-day Saints uh, adhere to. And so, yes, that is seen for a lot of Latter-day Saints as a proof text
Hmm.
for that separation of Adonai as Jesus and Elohim as El the Father.
Hmm. Final question. At the end of the article that you wrote, you stated that Weavers calls it a clear affirmation of monotheism, and yet the translator deals twice in the same chapter with sons of God after altering one reference to gods. His monotheistic affirmation only holds if he demotes the sons of God far enough below Yahweh to be an entirely separate and divine class of divine being, which is precisely what his expansion in Deuteronomy 32:43 seems to accomplish. What's the significance of that?
I think that so what's going on in Deuteronomy 43 is the gods are being reframed as something other than the gods. The Septuagint's expansion puts two things in parallel. It refers to the children of God, but then in kind of a poetic repetition refers to them as angels. And so this is a way to say the children of God are really just angels. And that establishes, supports, defends that demotion of the deities that took place in the post-exilic period leading into the Greco-Roman period, whereas rather than patron deities over each nation, they have been squished down and they are just angels. And you don't have to do it every single time there's a reference to them. You just have to do it enough times so that people will use that interpretive framework to interpret the other places where it occurs. And so it's just generating a theological preference. And I think that's something that took place in the Hellenistic period. Now, I would not go so far as to say that this is monotheistic. And I wrote that paper before I've developed a lot of my thinking about monotheism. But I think monotheism is a problematic category for any part of the Bible, including the New Testament. And at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in November, I'll be presenting a paper where I outline why I think monotheism should not be used in reference to the literature of the Bible, at least not when it was how it was understood when it was originally composed and originally consumed. But Weaver's writing many decades ago, the conceptualization of monotheism was much different then, and a lot of scholars accepted the identification of the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, with angels, as was asserted in the Hellenistic period. And still to this day, we find a lot of folks who talk about that, scholars who will say Genesis 6 doesn't say a word about angels anywhere around Genesis 6, but they'll read that as a reference to angels, precisely because the Septuagint and other much later texts interpret them that way.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Daniel McClellan. And I would like to have you back at some point. I really enjoyed this talk.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and I would be happy to join you again.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a